Thank you for being here. I'm Rabbi Phil Kaplan from the Great Synagogue in Sydney. It's a pleasure. This is my first time being part of Limmud in Australia, New Zealand. Just living in Australia for close to a year now. So my first Limmud here. So thank you, and thank you for coming for the session. So first thing I want to pose is why this topic? So I am not personally Kohen, so it's not something personal, but I do think the status of Kohanim is something fascinating. There's two biblical models of Tuma and Tahara that are relevant to us today of purity and impurity. The laws of Nida having to do with family purity and the laws of Kohanim. So while Nida status is something that's cyclical during the years in which a woman is menstruating and married, meaning at times a woman's Nida cycle means that she and her husband can or cannot engage in physical intimacy. The status of Kohanim is a constant. So from the time that a Kohen, a boy who's the son of a Kohen, is born until the day he dies, he has a status and he has these obligations to avoid certain forms of impurity. So I think it's a really unique status, a really unique manifestation of biblical law in modernity. And there arise these really interesting contemporary halakhic questions because of that. So I just think it's such an interesting topic, and I want to look at a few of those. First, I want to do, there's a lot of things I want to cover, but I'll start with a brief explanation of that status. I think that's most important. So hopefully everyone has a source sheet. So we're looking at source 1 under the topic of the status of Kohanim and the prohibition of defilement. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe emor el HaKohanim b'nei Aaron v'amarta alehem lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, none shall defile himself for any dead person among his people. And then it says, except for the relatives that are closest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, and his brother. So the Kohanim are not allowed to become impure to the dead, except for the relatives whom they are halakhically considered a mourner, and then they're obligated to become impure for them. So their parents, children, siblings, and wife. The next source, I think I'll just summarize. There's a lot of sources, so some of them I'm gonna have to either skip or summarize, but I wanted you all to have all the sources to look at on your own time if you'd like to follow up and learn more in depth. So this source is, kind of lets us know from the Shulchan Aruch that it's not just about a dead body itself. It could also be about coming into contact with a limb, parts directly near a grave, so the stone covering the grave also imparts impurity to the Kohen that he needs to avoid. Being with a body in a covered space, so not even directly touching it, but just being in an enclosed space or underneath a canopy of certain type with certain conditions are met, can also impart that purity. Or also, the Kohanim need to avoid just being, if there's a field where there was burial taking place and we don't know exactly where the bodies were buried, still the Kohanim need to avoid that. Then that's another really interesting contemporary question that comes up. A very unfortunate one is that, for example, if someone who's a Kohen wants to go on a tour of the camps from the Shoah, it could be very complicated. There's certain places they just can't go because of, unfortunately, not knowing exactly where people were buried. So that's another very complicated modern halakhic question. I want to bring attention just to the last part of this, the Ramah, the Ashkenazi gloss on the Shulchan Aruch. He says, if we look in the English, the italicized words there at the end of this source number 2, some say that Kohanim are forbidden to defile themselves for a sword that became unclean through contact with the corpse, and some are lenient in this matter, and thus it is the accepted custom to adopt the lenient view. So this is going to become relevant when we talk about an object, certain objects, particularly metal objects that came in contact with a corpse. It's going to be really relevant for one of our questions, so just hold that in your head for when that comes up. Source number 3, Benot Aharon lo huzharu al tumat met shenemar emor el kohanim b'nei Aharon below Benot Aharon. So this is just the source saying daughters of Aaron are not warned on becoming impure to the dead, as it says, say to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron. So it's particularly for male sons of the males of a Kohen have these same prohibitions. There is something, the Bat Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, does have certain privileges being the daughter of a Kohen. So she would be able to partake of the offerings that her father has privilege to Truma, and therefore being as part of his family, she also gets to take part of that. So She has the privileged side of it, but not the prohibition that her brother would have to not ever encounter the dead except for immediate relatives. Source number 4. Rava raised an objection. From where is it derived that if a Kohen does not want to observe the strictures against disqualified women, that the court forces him? The verse says, and you shall sanctify him. He shall be sacred for you, which indicates that this was performed even against his will. So Kohanim, we learn from the Torah, are not allowed to marry certain women. They're not allowed to marry a convert or a divorcee, for example. And we would not allow him to do so. So this also still has practical ramifications in modernity. So as an Orthodox rabbi, I wouldn't be able to perform a wedding for a Kohen and a woman who was divorced, for example. So that's another contemporary case that comes out, unfortunately, quite frequently. It's a very difficult thing to have to tell people that you won't be able to have them have an Orthodox wedding. It's very challenging. Source number 5. He will defile himself on her account. Not only may he defile himself, but he is commanded to do so. If he declines to do so, the court forces him to do so. The Sifra relates that a certain priest by the name of Yosef, whose wife had died on the eve of Passover, and he did not want to defile himself at her funeral, as then he would not be able to fulfill the commandment of eating the Paschal lamb on the following night, was forced to do so by the sages nonetheless. So I love this. It's a real practical story, hundreds of years ago that the Chizkuni is relating, or even thousands. Oh, yeah, of course, it has to do with eating the Paschal lamb. So quite a while ago, when we still had the temple and the ability to do that, this Kohen, he didn't want to go to his own wife's funeral because he was going to miss out on this once a year event that's really important for him as a Kohen, and the sages forced him to do so. So there's this balance here of this sanctity that they have and the need for them to keep it, except when they're not supposed to, that we'll see a little bit more of and what that means. So this leads to a question of, can a Kohen actively choose to give up his status? So let's see, here's a source I think that really sums that up well. The Aruch HaShulchan really kind of, I think, does the best job of conceptualizing this balance that we're getting at. So he says, it is clear that when it comes to the ways in which God confers sanctity upon them, i.e. the marriage restrictions and the prohibitions of becoming tameh, of becoming impure, they have no ability to change this, and it is not up to them, for it derives from a divine decree. But when it comes to those areas where we must sanctify them, in other words, show them honor, that is indeed in their control to accept or waive. So this whole idea of maybe you've heard it, like, can a Kohen give up his status if he wants to do one of these things that's forbidden? What does that mean? Is it an obligation nonetheless? Or the Aruch HaShulchan really, I think, conceptualizes this best and breaks it down into 2 kind of categories. And I would define them as kedusha, holiness, sanctity, versus kavod, versus honor. So the Kohen can give up his honor. He could say, you know what, I don't want to have the first aliyah. I'll leave the room. I don't want to be here for that, right? That's an honor that the congregation does for him. And also there's a lot of other historical reasons for that. But in terms of his sanctity, his holiness, the community, the entire community, Kohanim and non-Kohanim alike, everyone, all the Jewish people, have an obligation of sorts to maintain his sanctity, because that is something that God commanded, and is about the relationship between the Kohen and God, not the Kohen and the community. We honor the Kohen. God sanctified the Kohen and commands us to do the same thing. So just a quick summary of this section. What have we learned about the Kohanim from these sources? So 1, they cannot make themselves impure through contact with the dead. 2, except for their immediate family, for whom they are obligated to do so. So when they need to become impure for their family, they must. They can't refrain from it because they want to be so holy and stay pure. Not allowed. 3, they need to be strict even for parts of a body or an area where bodies are buried, and the exact location is unknown. So there's more strictures that come out of this beyond just touching the dead body. 4, this rule applies only to males, does not apply to the daughters of Kohanim. 5, the rest of the Jewish people have an obligation to maintain the sanctity of the Kohanim, so much so that the sages would force a Kohen not to marry a woman who's forbidden to him. This is important, the idea of maintaining the Kohen's sanctity. that being a communal obligation and on other people, is important regarding children who are Kohanim, which will come up in one of our other questions, that normally with children, we just have a mitzvah of chinuch, that a father and mother are obligated to teach their children in mitzvot, and that's not actually counting for anything for the child, but we have an obligation, parents have an obligation to teach their children. This goes beyond that. So for a young boy who's a Kohen, we as a Jewish community cannot lead him to impurity. It's not that we have to teach him in the ways of staying pure because he's a Kohen. We also cannot lead him into it, which will come up in one of our questions, which will be important for that. 6, the inverse is true as well. If the Kohen thought of himself as so holy that he didn't want to defile himself to attend his wife or sister's funeral, for example, he would be forced to do so. And then 7, I think the Aruch HaShulchan explaining it best, distinction can be conceptualized as kedusha, sanctity, versus kavod, honor. While the Kohen can waive his honor, he's not allowed to waive his sanctity. We would force him to maintain his sanctity. And this is a mitzvah on all of us. Okay, so now let's get into our questions, the contemporary issues. And we might skip some sources because there's a bunch, but hopefully we'll get a little bit of a taste for each question. And then I'll, at the end of each, I kind of focus on one part of it and then do a little summary of the other pieces that we aren't going to look at sources inside directly. Okay, so framing the question, can a Kohen be a doctor? The fundamental concern when we ask whether a Kohen can become a doctor is not about working as a doctor per se, but more so about attending medical school. While work as a doctor has a direct connection to pikuach nefesh, saving of a life, training is not directly connected in the same way, which we'll see. Most significantly, medical school requires working with cadavers, meaning directly handling a dead body, which raises this concern, this important concern of tumat met, the impurity of the dead the Kohen needs to stay away from. So from the case of the Nazir, the Nazirite in the Torah, we also learn things about the Kohen. They both have to refrain from this form of impurity, and so we learn from those parallels. So a lot of the sources when thinking about Kohanim are actually sources from the Nazirite or from Nazir, from the Talmud. So we'll look at some of those sources. Source number 1. However, with regard to contracting impurity from a corpse, and again contracting impurity from a corpse, so one after another, i.e. if a person contracted impurity imparted by a corpse and then touched another corpse while still in contact with the first corpse, he is not liable for the second impurity, as he has already become impure and is standing in a state of ritual impurity. So there is only one punishment for coming into contact if he's still engaged in this contact in the same level of impurity, and we'll see how those levels differentiate themselves. Cannot incur a punishment while currently engaged in this first act of contact with impurity. Okay, source number 2, I think I'll skip to the second paragraph of it. When does this apply? When he became impure and then returned and touched, carried, or stood over the corpse. If, however, he was touching a corpse and while the corpse was still in his hand, he touched another corpse, he is liable only once, even though he was warned for each time he touched it, for his state has already become desecrated. So there's a distinction here between becoming impure, being away from the body, not being in contact with it or in an enclosed space with it, and then approaching that body or another body again, compared to touching one corpse and then simultaneously touching another. So for the first case, if he goes away from it and then comes back, he's doing an additional prohibition, and he is punished for both prohibitions by the court. In the second case, already holding one body and then touching another one, there's no additional prohibition. This distinction has to do with his ability to impart tuma, impurity, at the time. So when he's currently touching a body, the Kohen is a av tuma, the highest level of tuma himself, of impurity, and then able to impart this status to something else he touches, this high level status, as opposed to when he touches something and then goes away from it, and then he can only impart rishon l'tuma, the next level down. So that distinction in how he's able to impart impurity is what determines if he's already at the highest level, then doing something at the highest level again doesn't mean anything. It's not an additional prohibition. It's not an additional transgression. If he goes away from it and then comes back, then he's increasing his level to impart that he can impart, and therefore an additional prohibition occurred. I think I'm going to skip sources 3 and 4 so we can get to the other sections, and also because source Number 5, I think is great. I really want to get to that one. But essentially, they talk about this parallel of the Nazir and the Kohen, and about how we learn from when the Nazir is forced to shave his head and restart the Nazir process, that means it's a prohibition, and when he doesn't have to do that, then it's not a prohibition that would be from a biblical prohibition on the Kohen. Okay, but let's move on to source number 5, and then I'll summarize this topic a little bit. This is from Rav Moshe Feinstein, probably the most important 20th century American Ashkenazi posek, halachic decider. So I'll read this in English to you. Behold, it is very simple and clear that it is forbidden for a Kohen to cause himself to become impure to a dead body. It is forbidden to the Kohen to learn medicine at a school that is in countries where it is required that they become impure by way of a dead body. But the position that it is permitted by way of pikuach nefesh is stupidity and nonsense, that a thinking person shouldn't say this. Even if there wasn't any doctor in the world, there wouldn't be an obligation on account of pikuach nefesh to learn medicine, because the obligation of pikuach nefesh is that all people must save their fellow by what they are able to, by any means that they're capable of. That is, that if he were a doctor, he is obligated to save a sick person from his illness. But there isn't an obligation that he learns medicine in order to save a sick person from his illness. Like with tzedakah, giving of charity, that if a person has no money, he isn't obligated to give tzedakah, but there isn't an obligation on a person to do business in order to become rich, in order to give tzedakah. So I think it's a really interesting take and an important source about the ways in which we often use that argument of pikuach nefesh. So if someone were already a doctor, the pikuach nefesh argument would be very strong, right? Because then a doctor has to do whatever they can, even becoming impure, a doctor has to do whatever they can to save another human life. However, learning to become a doctor, that's a big stretch for Rav Moshe, and I think his logic is pretty sound here. That if we were saying that were the meaning of the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, I think then you would have to say we all have to learn medicine, right? We all have to know basic life-saving skills, or more than basic. Maybe we all have to, maybe every Jew should be a doctor. Every Jew has to be a doctor or a nurse or some kind of healthcare professional. It would be ridiculous to say you have to learn in order to save a life. So that's just, I like that source just because, not because the conclusion I think should be that someone shouldn't be able to become a doctor, but I think using the pikuach nefesh argument is a little weak. So I just wanted to give that kind of cutting source to challenge that position on it. But I will go over the positions now really quickly and be able to say what leniencies do exist that are a little bit more legitimate than the pikuach nefesh one. So one thing is that perhaps there are some leniencies available, such as we don't know for sure the status of our Kohanim today. Is the lineage perfect? Is someone, maybe all Kohanim are doubtful that they're actually Kohanim. I know that a few years ago we had this revelation about the Kohen gene. So maybe we were pretty good about maintaining the status. So I don't know how relevant it is to say that we have to be suspect of people's Kohanim status, but in a kind of like very strict halachic sense, that you can maybe say that we have a doubt about someone's status. Or maybe impurity to non-Jews is okay. There's that position that it has to do with encountering a dead body of a Jewish person only. So maybe the majority of the cadavers that they're going to encounter wouldn't be an issue. You could make that argument based on who it is. Or maybe we're all tamei anyway. We're all impure anyway. We're all, most of us, born in a hospital, which is allowed. You're allowed to be born in a hospital even if you're giving birth to a Kohen baby, because of that we consider pregnancy and childbirth to be dangerous, and it's important for saving the life of the mother and child. So we're all born in hospitals that have morgues, and maybe we're all impure from pretty early on in our lives anyway, and maybe that doesn't that means that the additional impurity isn't as problematic. I don't think any of these arguments alone is sufficient. A really popular opinion, or commonly used one, is one of Rav Goren. So Rav Goren, which I'll explain right after, says the Kohen should wear a metal pin that was in contact with a dead body, and I'll get back to that in a second. And then we have the Rav Moshe opinion that not allowed to learn medicine if dissecting cadavers is mandatory. So let me just go over these in a little more detail and then move on to our next thing. So the Rav Goren position, I think, really ingenious solution. So based on the idea in the Talmud that a metal object that comes in contact with a dead body has the same level of tuma, of impurity, as the dead body itself. But like we read in the Ramah, the second source on our source sheet, it wouldn't be forbidden for a Kohen to contact such a metal object, even though contacting a dead body is forbidden. This object that has the same level of impurity would not be forbidden. So once in contact with a tameh, with an impure metal pin, it is like the case of the Kohen holding onto one body and then touching another body, which we said was not forbidden, or it doesn't increase his level of impurity and therefore isn't a prohibition, which we said that it wasn't a violation earlier, right? So he will not be increasing his level of tuma and will not be transgressing the prohibition to become tameh by a dead body. So the solution is the Kohen should wear this little metal pin that was in contact with a dead body, and then he's allowed to do dissections, he's allowed to work with cadavers, allowed to study medicine. And that is a solution that I have heard many Kohanim use, is doing this Rav Goren solution. Another solution would be hypothetically if there were some kind of, I don't know if this exists, I'm not familiar, but if there were a medical school that didn't require working with cadavers directly, that would be another solution. And then already being a doctor, so if someone is a doctor, now they're worried, oh no, what do I do? I'm a Kohen, I'm a doctor already. That's not an issue. The issue is really about medical school, because once you're a doctor, you do have the obligation to do all this within your power and training in order to save a life. So therefore, because you already have that status of being capable, you would even according to the opinions that forbid training with cadavers, you would be allowed to do it because you're already trained. Maybe early in your life, you did a prohibition, but now that's behind you. And now it's allowed because of Pikuach Nefesh. Okay. Our next case. Does medical innovation, whereby we can now easily find out the gender of a baby in utero, require that we resolve a doubt? So this is the question of, need the pregnant wife of a Kohen have concern for being in contact with a dead body in case her child is male? So if the fetus is a boy, must the wife of a Kohen avoid tumat maid? This would assume tuma can be contacted through the mother, that the Kohen fetuses, and that a Kohen fetus already has his kahuna, his Kohen status. But is this so? So that's the question that we really have to ask. I'm looking at one really particular part of that with the sources, and then I'll summarize the other positions and our conclusion. Source number one, the Rokeach wrote that the wife of a Kohen that is pregnant is allowed to enter into a tent or a room with a dead body because it is a sveka. Perhaps the baby is not viable, or perhaps the baby is female. So the halakhic concept of sveka, a double doubt, allows us to rule leniently when there's a double doubt. So without sonograms and other medical technologies and innovation, we wouldn't know whether the fetus were male or female, and wouldn't know if the fetus were viable, meaning that it can survive past a month or so after birth. But does this double doubt hold up in modernity? So this is, what I love about this question is that it's a case in which technology actually possibly forces us to be more strict. As a question of that, does our ability to find out more information because of modernity mean that we have an obligation to do so? That's really the essence of this piece of that question. Does this double doubt hold up in modernity? Baruch Hashem, the infant mortality rate has dropped tremendously. And furthermore, we know that it's very easy to find out the sex of a baby in utero. Blood test, sonogram, it's not complicated anymore. Okay, source number two. Just the important part is actually just the first few lines, so I'll just read that so we can move on. And to cause him, the child, to enter a house where there is tuma in it, thus to sweep him into other prohibitions, is forbidden, even for an infant who isn't at the age of comprehension still. So I thought this is the second part of the source is similar about presenting that sveka, that double doubt. But the first part that I just read, as the idea that I talked about earlier briefly, that keeping a child, children of Kohanim, away from tuma is more than just a matter of chinuch, of education. It's not like other mitzvot where we just have to teach him so that he knows how to avoid tuma when he's an adult and has the obligation himself, but rather it's also a prohibition on us that we can't lead even a child Kohen into tuma. We would be transgressing our obligation to sanctify them, that God gave us the obligation to sanctify the Kohanim, and therefore, more than just chinuch, we cannot lead a child who's a Kohen to tuma. Okay, getting back to the sveka point. Source number 3, the Shach, he says, therefore it seems when it is possible to check, such as when it is in front of you and there isn't any loss, you should check. But when there it is not, there's no need to be strict. So he says, in a case of a sveka where there's no additional, whether it be financial cost or health cost, if it were dangerous to find out the sex of the baby in utero, you wouldn't have any obligation to do it. If it cost a ton more money, you wouldn't have to do it. But if you're already getting a sonogram, that it would fit in with the Shach's answer that if you're already getting a sonogram, it's easy additional question to ask. So you can clarify the sveka with no cost, then you should. So it was a question of whether that the sveka argument is what holds up. So let's look at other positions. I'm not going to go into detail. It gets very complicated, actually. So let's go through the different positions that we could have. Okay, position number 1, no need to resolve it. Sorry, you do need to resolve a doubt. And if you find out it's a boy, then the mother would need to be concerned about tuma. Another position would be there's no need to resolve the doubt. Just don't find out the gender at the sonogram. Okay. You could say that the sveka holds up even if further investigation could clarify it. No, it holds up. Okay, position 3 and 4 bring in this really, really fascinating idea of tara balua. So that means like absorbed, swallowed up. So does something inside another thing, is it able to contract tuma, or does the first entity protect it? So a really interesting question to apply to mothers and their children in utero. So something swallowed in something else doesn't contract tuma. That's one of the positions held by many, right? So the mother is essentially in a very nice idea, protecting her fetus, both in a physical sense and in a spiritual sense from the tuma. Parablua, there could be a position that it only works. I think this might be the minority position, that it only works for foreign objects. I only saw one source on that. Why else would it be, a question was raised, when a non-Jewish pregnant woman immerses to convert, the baby is then Jewish as well. So why would that be, if not, we were saying that something immersed is part of the existing entity when it's not a foreign object. So if someone swallowed a piece of metal or a coin or a ring or something by accident, then that would be a foreign object. That would be protected by this concept, but not something that's a part of its body. And we say ubar yarachimo, that the fetus is like a limb of its mother. There's a source that says that. Okay, and then the next position, maybe a fetus isn't even a Kohen. So we have this line in the Gemara. Rabbah said that this is Rabbi Yossi's reasoning. He holds that a fetus in the womb of a non-priest is a non-priest. So you have a Kohen father, and the mother is not herself a Kohen. So that that child is going to be a Kohen in utero. No, there's a position that says that. So that could be the reasoning as well. So conclusion. Most sources seem not to be concerned about this issue of a fetus becoming tamei in utero for one reason or another. So I think the overwhelming majority of poskim end up ruling leniently for one reason or another. There are some that are not lenient, but many are. So you have the sveka, that it holds up even, so that by that position, you would have to not investigate whether the child was male or female. If you hold that way, that's the reason why. The other reason being that the mother, this tara balua, that the mother is sort of shielding her baby. And then also the position that maybe the fetus doesn't even have the status of being a Kohen. I was just thinking about, I don't have any source or evidence for this, but there is like a custom that some women have not to go to funerals, not to go to cemeteries while they're pregnant. And I wonder to what extent that was influenced by this. I don't have the answer to that, but just an interesting thing I was thinking about, that maybe it is in some way related. Maybe it's a custom taken by all the women to specifically address issues that would be for a woman who is married to a Kohen, but who knows? Okay, and then the last question. Can a Kohen who has killed someone dukhan? Can they do the nesiat kapayim, the raising of the hands that they do we have in Ashkenazi communities, we do just on the holidays. In Sephardi communities, they do every day. The raising of the hands to bless the congregation that biblically the Kohanim are commanded to do, that the sons of Aaron will always be blessing the Jewish people. And that we have this important mitzvah to do on the holidays. Okay, so framing the question. We have sources about not using hands stained with blood for holy tasks, and that God shuns blood-stained hands. For example, David HaMelech, King David, wasn't allowed to build the temple because of his warrior past. When Kohanim blessed the congregation, they're quite literally using their hands as a means of giving blessing. Their hands are essentially like an instrument of blessing. So it's a very strong kind of symbolic gesture to, I think, this concept that makes this concept very relevant. Can a Kohen who has killed continue to duchen? Are there mitigating circumstances that will influence this decision? So our primary source for this question comes from Isaiah. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. So this is the primary source that we use for this for this prohibition of Kohanim who have killed not being allowed to duchen. I think just a side note, it's important to note the sources from Isaiah. And there's a huge question, somewhat unresolved question of where do laws learn from books of Nach, of Nevi'im Ketuvim, so not from the Torah? Does it count as, we have biblical laws and we have rabbinic laws? Where do laws derived from those sources factor in? Because they're neither Torah nor are they just rabbinic. They have a strong source. So there's kind of a debate of whether they're on a biblical level or rabbinic level. So that also could be an influencing factor, and just a side note I want to share. Okay, now the primary Talmudic source that uses this verse from Isaiah and applies it in this context. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, kol kohen sheharag et hanefesh, lo yisad kapav shene'emar yidechem damim maleu. Rabbi Yochanan said, any priest who killed a person may not lift his hands for the priestly blessing, as it is said, and when you spread forth your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Your hands are full of blood. So this is our Talmudic source for our question. Now let's get into the halacha. So we have from the Shulchan Aruch, a Kohen who has killed a person, even unintentionally, may not perform the priestly blessing, even if he has repented. Ramah, the Ashkenazi gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, adds, some say that if he has repented, he may perform the blessing, and there is ground to be lenient with respect to the penitent, so as not to shut the door before them. And so is the custom, because this is not worse than a repentant apostate. Okay. So that's a huge distinction, a huge difference between our main Sephardi and Ashkenazi halachic sources, the book that we refer to for many halachic questions. The Ramah, the Ashkenazi source, saying that you can repent and then therefore be allowed to duchen, and the Shulchan Aruch saying no, tshuva, repentance, is not sufficient for the Kohen in this situation. Okay. Source number 4, I think another source from the Talmud that has what to say about this this question. V'atorah amra ba laharlecha hashkem lahargo. Okay, so the Torah says if someone comes to kill you, kill him first. So there's we have a source for self-defense, and we there I think it must be an additional distinction made here between murder and killing. So and I think that'll be an influence on a lot of the modern poskim when answering this question. We know from the Torah and the Talmud that killing in self-defense is not murder, and is in fact commanded, that if you should the idea of rodef, of someone going after another person to kill them, that they should be killed first, so as not to do that. Okay, the next source from Ovadia Yosef. I apologize for not having this the original Hebrew for this one. I took it from another sheet I had done where I just had the English. I also apologize for it saying Yechave Das. That wouldn't be as the most important Sephardi posek of the past generation. He wouldn't have pronounced it that way. So that was a mistake on my part. Okay, here, in the case of Israeli soldiers who had to kill enemy soldiers in battle, in a defensive war where Kohanim risked their lives to confront the enemy and to save Jewish lives, it is proper to tell these soldiers, Yeyasher kolchechem, and may your hands be strengthened. The matter is clear beyond any shadow of a doubt that they are eligible and worthy of Nesiat Kapayim, meaning the dukhaning, raising of their hands, and they should be blessed from the one above. So Rabbi Ovadia is speaking specifically to his context, the modern state of Israel. He asked the question, how can it be that soldiers who were compelled to kill in self-defense and defense of the Jewish land and people are unworthy of blessing the congregation? It can't be, he concludes. So he's really influenced by this strong theological impulse, this sense of it cannot be that someone who did something that was, in a sense, a mitzvah to protect the Jewish people and land of Israel, and had to do this, were compelled. How could it be that they're no longer worthy of blessing, imparting blessing to the congregation? There's something very troubling for him, I think, theologically there that motivates him. Okay, so positions. What are the positions in this? Be'ones, forced compulsion. So a soldier or someone else defending their life is compelled to kill in order to protect themselves and others. This is not a disqualified kind of killing. Rabbi Ovadia elsewhere in another tshuva, he speaks about a person driving and someone unexpectedly runs out in front of their car. So it wasn't that they were being negligent or they were speeding. They were doing everything right, just driving, and then someone just unexpectedly came. This would also not be disqualifying, he says. Then Rabbi Ovadia introduces this additional variable, mitzvah. He adds, to strengthen his case, that specifically for IDF soldiers, for Israeli soldiers, since they're defending the land of Israel and the Jewish people, there's an additional justification for any unfortunately necessary killing. Wouldn't disqualify them from dukhaning. Other variables that come up into this halachic literature or on this question have to do with negligence, accident, unknowingly. And then tshuva, the variable of tshuva that we saw in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, does repenting work for this? The Ramah says the Kohen can duchen if he has repented, while the Shulchan Aruch says that doesn't suffice. So conclusion, the circumstances are very, very important for this question. So I would imagine a rabbi who is answering this for a Kohen would look at every case individually. So if someone killed purposefully, not in self-defense, they just murdered someone, I think almost all opinions would suggest they're disqualified unless you think that the Ramah's opinion applies even in that case. But I think many people don't think the Ramah is talking about that. He's talking about these accidental, compelled kind of cases that you can repent for and then be fine. So probably someone who murdered someone outright would not ever be allowed to duchen. Once you get into the territory of accidental and circumstantially compelled, there's a very strong argument to permit. Both Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote powerfully about tshuvot permitting soldiers who killed in order to continue dukhaning. In Rabbi Ovadia's context, he was talking about Israeli soldiers. Rav Moshe wrote a tshuva that had to do with soldiers fighting in Europe. So even for that, even without that maybe land of Israel, Jewish people, mitzvah component, Rav Moshe still felt that killing in war is like an unfortunate necessity, and one is compelled to defend themselves and others, and therefore wouldn't be disqualifying. Okay, I haven't been looking at the chat, so I haven't seen any of the questions, but maybe our moderator, Danielle, can tell me specific ones I should answer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rabbi. What a fabulous and really interesting talk. Really enjoyed it. So please join me in giving him a round of applause. Our first question you actually answered was about the what happens in the role of Israeli soldiers.
Ah, good.
The next question comes from Rivka, and I'll actually unmute her and get her to ask the question, because it's a double loaded question, if that's all right.
Okay, yeah.
Rivka, can you unmute yourself? Or do you need me to? Would you prefer me to ask the question?
Can you hear us now?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Amazing. Hi, Rabbi. Thanks for your presentation. Our question, we have a little group viewing here. So our room question was, we were wondering what the practical applications for these laws are. So if a Kohen wanted to join the shul, or if a couple, including a Kohen, approach you about conducting their wedding ceremony, are there special questions that you would ask them pertaining to these laws and customs that you wouldn't maybe need to ask a regular individual or a regular couple? And if so, what are some of those questions?
So you mean, so if a couple wanted to join and or be married who was a couple of where the man was a Kohen and the woman was one of the people that a Kohen is not allowed to marry?
Or just like I mean, I guess that would be one of the questions, would be to suss out, to make sure that obviously the woman is someone the Kohen can marry, but even just an individual wanting to join the shul in terms of like, would you need to ask, have you murdered anyone? Or like, you know, are there special questions to ask a Kohen, whether it's in the context of joining the shul or whether it's in the context of a wedding, that you wouldn't have to ask, like me, for instance, as someone who's not a Kohen?
Okay. Yeah. So definitely you wouldn't, I do not believe anyone asks if you've ever murdered anyone. We just, I think we assume like Rove, the majority of people haven't murdered anyone. And certainly if someone has had to kill, you know, the minority of people who've killed anyone in their life, it was probably in one of the contexts that's permitted. So you would never have to ask that unless someone came to you with it and asked you. In terms of joining the shul, it's my position, and I believe of the great synagogue where I'm rabbi, that, you know, any Jewish person, regardless of whether their relationship or their marriage was halakhically permitted or is halakhically permitted moving forward, any Jewish person is allowed to be a member at the synagogue. So that wouldn't prevent anyone from being a member of the synagogue. We welcome everyone of all different kind of arrangements and relationships. You do, yeah, before doing a wedding, you would have to, I mean, weddings actually, it's interesting. So weddings are the times that we're, you know, if a man that you've never seen off the street walks into Minyan and starts putting on tefillin, you don't say, are you Jewish? If there's only 10 men there, you know, we don't do that. We just assume someone who walks in knows what they're doing. And you know, is Jewish. If someone comes to Minyan, they're Jewish. But for weddings, we are supposed to do more research. So you are supposed to check and make sure some people are halakhically Jewish. You ask, in a normal circumstance, you would say, you know, are both your mothers Jewish, both your, you know, grandmothers, maternal grandmothers? Ask those questions. Was there any conversion in your family? Those are kind of normal things to ask in any case. The only additional one for Kohen would be the question of not just are there any conversions, but you know, either you married before becomes really, well, I guess actually it's relevant for anyone, right? Because for issues of you know, someone needs a halachic divorce in order to remarry. So maybe that would be relevant for anyone. So it's just for different reasons you're asking similar questions. I guess that's what I would say. So to do a wedding, yeah, you'd have to, you have additional reasons to be asking those questions.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rivka. Does anybody else have any questions? While you're come out with them. Oh, Pearl has a question. Pearl, I'll unmute you. Might have to unmute yourself. There we go. Welcome, Pearl.
Hi, thank you, Rabbi. Two questions that have been personal to my life. One is I'm a bat Kohen, and I was just really interested to know what sort of privileges does a bat Kohen have. I know one silly thing was I thought I couldn't walk amongst the graves in a graveyard, and my rabbi said, no, that doesn't apply to me, but that's just an example. And the second question is, can a gay male dukhan?
Okay. Just out of curiosity, what the part about walking amongst graves, why would that be a problem?
Well, it's not a problem. That's what my rabbi said.
Exactly.
But for a Kohen, it is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the right answer. Yeah. So
that's why I was sort of wondering what special things.
So okay, so for a bat Kohen, there's one, the biggest one I can think of that I mentioned briefly is not so relevant now that we don't have a temple. But when there is or when there was a temple or when there is a temple, the bat Kohen is able to eat of the truma. So the special offering that is the percentage taken for the Kohen goes to him and his family. So his sons and daughters, even the people in his household who aren't blood relatives. So if they have servants, they're allowed to partake of truma. So that's like the biblical one that isn't doesn't have a modern, that privilege doesn't extend in modernity without a temple. And then the other one would be that when I don't know if it's a privilege but it's just an interesting thing that when we have a firstborn boy, a bachor, so a firstborn boy through a that was the first child of the mother and the vaginal birth, that boy we have a redemption, needs to be pidyon ben after 30 days. So we goes by either family. If there's a Kohen or a Levi in either family, they don't have to do that. So the son of a Bat Kohen also wouldn't need a Pidyon Haben because of his mother's father being a Kohen, he has to be redeemed.
Okay. Is there any value to the fact that you know how the Kohanim can bless people at any time? There seems to be a lot more of just an, casual blessing. Is there any more value of a Bat Kohen being able to bless people?
That's a really great question. I haven't seen things written about that. I think there are like kind of like modern kind of movements that like touch upon stuff like that about the female Kohen kind of. I'm not so familiar with it, and I haven't read any literature on it.
Okay.
There is an interesting connection with her being the daughter of someone whose job it was to bless the people. That maybe there is some kind of like inherent. It's a nice idea, but I'm not familiar personally.
Yeah.
And then I'll answer your second question. That yes, I think that's perfectly fine. I haven't heard of. I'm sure, unfortunately, there's people that would say that a gay man is inherently prohibited from doing that. I don't think that's the case. That wouldn't be the case at my shul. That would be fine. The same way it's fine for a gay man to have an aliyah. That if he's a Kohen, then that's what he blesses the congregation, unless he's specifically prohibited from that from some reason that's about Kohanim being prohibited, like unless he murdered someone, or unless there's other ideas in literature about what it means for that role, and there's other things about like what else has like maybe like a Kohen is a particularly like shady character. That there's like concern about him being up there representing and blessing the community. But I wouldn't say that I would never use that to apply to this, and I would say that it's fine.
Can I just ask, sort of follows on from all of this, but does a Kohen have to be Shomer Shabbat to duchen?
No, not in my shul, and not I don't think anyone there, that's a question that's changed a lot over modernity. So I can go to a lot of literature on someone who's not Shomer Shabbat having an aliyah. That's like a very a common halakhic question that was really big in the 19th and 20th century. And essentially, most people came down on the side of, I know there's some maybe ultra-Orthodox communities that wouldn't allow that someone to have an aliyah, a man to have an aliyah if he's not observant. But most people, I'm sure, most modern Orthodox shuls you go to or Chabad that you go to have all the time non-observant men have aliyot, and basically the idea would be like, unless someone is actively like against Judaism, practices another religion, or is like says outright like I don't believe in any of this. This is all unless they're actively a non-believer, that we assume that most people in that moment or in general might not be observant, but observance doesn't. In modernity doesn't have the same implications that it had in the past when everyone was observant and there was more of a shtetl community. It was a big deal to be publicly not observant, and now it doesn't send the same message that it does, that it used to send in modernity. To be publicly not observant, it doesn't mean the same kind of affirmation of one's lack of belief.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pearl. We've actually run out of time, but I do have one more question. So, Rabbi, are you happy to stay on for another question? All right, I will just unmute. There we go. Please welcome Sandra.
Thanks for your presentation, Rabbi. In the case of a divorced woman who is forbidden to marry a Kohen, what is it about her divorce status that makes her unsuitable to be the wife of a Kohen?
So it's just, the prohibition is just written without giving a reason in the biblical text. It says that the Kohen is not allowed to marry these women, and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, has the additional prohibition of not being allowed to marry even a widow. So he has to marry someone who hasn't been married before and who was born Jewish. The Kohen Gadol, the regular Kohen, only has a prohibition, has fewer prohibitions. He's allowed to marry a widow. I think, this is all theory, and there might be more sources that I'm unfamiliar with that go into greater detail. about that reason, but like I have a sense of it being about the specific difference between the divorcee and the widow makes me think that there's like a difference about, is there someone who knows her intimately, who's still like walking around, and how that affects his the kind of sanctity of their marriage, or the sanctity. There's something about that, I think, that has something to do with it. But I don't, I just know the biblical text just says these are the people that are prohibited from him, and I'm sure there's writing about it that I'm unfamiliar with, but that's just a theory I have, and I think one of the reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our session. I'm actually going to unmute everyone and get everyone to give an audible round of applause, and then please enjoy your next session. So a big round of applause.
Thank you, Rabbi.
If you want to see
All right, Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your learning, everyone, and have a great Sunday.